Let me tell you about the 5 days that changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. About friendship, about fear, and about what happens when two men push too deep into country that doesn't forgive mistakes. My name doesn't matter now, but what happened up in those mountains that matters. That matters more than anything I've ever experienced. And I need you to understand every detail, because someday you might find yourself in those woods, and when you do, you'll need to know what's waiting up there in the shadows. It was late October, when Jake Morrison and I headed up into the Cascade range for what we figured would be our last hunt of the season. The weather window was closing fast. Snow was forecast for the high country within the week, and once winter set in, these mountains became a death trap for anyone foolish enough to venture beyond the marked trails. We'd been hunting together for 15 years, ever since we met at a gun show in Seattle. Jake was the kind of man you could depend on, quiet, methodical, with an eye for tracking that came from spending half his life in the woods. He could read sign like other men read newspapers, picking up details in broken twigs and displaced soil that would escape most hunters entirely. He worked construction during the week, but weekends and hunting season belonged to the mountains. I brought my AR-10 with a Leupold VX5 HD scope mounted on a solid bipod system, enough rifle to drop anything that walked these mountains. Jake preferred his grandfather's Remington 700 in 300 Winchester Magnum, a rifle that had never let his family down in 3 generations of hunting. That old gun had taken elk, deer and black bear across 3 states, and Jake maintained it like his life depended on it, which, in country like this, it might. The trail started easy enough. We parked at the Cascade Creek trailhead just before dawn on a Tuesday. The air so crisp it made your lungs ache with that clean, sharp cold that only comes in the high country. Pine sap hung heavy in the air, mixed with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves and that indefinable scent of snow that's still weeks away but already whispering in the wind. The forecast called for clear weather for 3 days, then a storm system moving in from the Pacific. We had a tight window get in, find our quarry and get out before the weather turned ugly. In these mountains, a late-season storm could dump 3 feet of snow overnight, turning familiar trails into unmarked death traps. We hiked for 6 hours that first day, climbing steadily through Douglas fir and western hemlock until we reached a small meadow at about 4,200 feet elevation. The grass was brown and brittle, frost-covered in the shadows where the morning sun hadn't yet reached. It was perfect hunting country water nearby from a small creek, good sightlines in 3 directions, and plenty of deadfall for firewood. More importantly, it showed fresh sign. Jake set up his tent about 30 yards from mine, close enough that we could talk in normal voices, but far enough apart that we wouldn't keep each other awake with snoring or rustling around. That first night was everything you'd want from a hunting camp. We ate beef jerky and heated beans over a small camp stove, drank coffee, black and strong, and talked about the country we'd seen on the hike in. "This is prime habitat," Jake said, studying a topographical map by headlamp. "See this drainage? Connects to 3 different valleys. Game's going to be moving through here regular-like, especially with winter coming on." I nodded, cleaning my rifle by the light of my headlamp. The familiar routine was soothing, checking the bolt action, ensuring the scope mounts were tight, running a cleaning rod through the barrel. Everything had to be perfect. In country like this, you might only get 1 shot, and it had to count. The night sounds were what you'd expect owls calling from the timber, the occasional snap of a branch settling in the cold, wind sighing through the trees. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the kind of wilderness symphony that puts you to sleep better than any sleeping pill ever could. We were up before dawn the next morning, moving slow and quiet through the timber. Jake took point, reading sign as we went. Within an hour he'd found deer tracks in the soft earth near the creek, fresh prints, maybe 12 hours old. We followed them upstream, moving careful and deliberate, stopping every 50 yards to glass the country ahead with our binoculars. It was around noon when we found the first bear sign. Jake stopped so suddenly I almost walked into him. He was crouched next to a large cedar tree, studying something at its base. I came up beside him and saw what had caught his attention. Claw marks in the bark, deep gouges that started about 3 feet off the ground and extended up another 4 feet. "Big bear," Jake whispered, running his finger along one of the scratches. "Real big." The marks were fresh, you could see where sap had oozed out and was still tacky to the touch. But what struck me as unusual was the height and the violence of the marking. I've seen plenty of bear sign over the years, and most bears will mark trees at shoulder height, maybe a bit higher when they're stretching. These marks showed a bear that could reach higher than any I'd encountered, and the depth of the gouges suggested powerful, almost frenzied clawing. "What do you figure?" I asked. 7-foot bear? Jake shook his head slowly. Bigger. Maybe 8 feet, standing up. Could be a record book black bear. They get monsters up in this country sometimes. We weren't in grizzly country. The last confirmed grizzly in the Cascades had been killed decades ago. But looking at those claw marks, feeling the thickness of the bark that had been peeled away like paper, I found myself checking my rifle to make sure I had a round chambered. We followed the bear's trail for the next 2 hours. The tracks were impressive paw prints, nearly the size of dinner plates, with claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the pad impressions. The bear was moving purposefully, following game trails and creek beds with the confidence of an animal that knew it owned these mountains. The trail led us deeper into the timber, through sections of old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that midday felt like twilight. It was in one of these dark sections that we first saw it. Jake had stopped to examine some massive droppings that confirmed we were dealing with an enormous animal, when I heard a branch break somewhere ahead of us. I looked up, scanning the shadows between the massive tree trunks, and there it was, standing motionless about 60 yards away, partially hidden behind a screen of young firs. It was the biggest black bear I'd ever seen. Standing on its hind legs, it had to be close to 8 feet tall, with shoulders that looked broad enough to fill a doorway. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in the shadows, and thick with the winter coat bears grow before hibernation. But something was wrong with its face. The bear's head was tilted at an odd angle, and as I studied it through my rifle scope, I realised why. Its left eye was missing, not just damaged, but completely gone, leaving a dark, scarred socket. The right eye was clouded over, probably from an old injury or infection. The bear was, for all practical purposes, blind. I slowly reached out and tapped Jake's shoulder, never taking my eyes off the creature. He looked up, followed my gaze, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "Jesus," he whispered. The bear dropped to all fours with a heavy thud that I felt through the ground. For a moment, I thought it was going to charge, and my finger found the trigger of my AR-10. But instead, it turned and moved back into the shadows, not with the clumsy motion you'd expect from a blind animal, but with a fluid grace that suggested it knew these woods intimately. We stood there for a full 5 minutes, hardly breathing, waiting for it to reappear. The forest around us had gone quiet, no bird calls, no squirrel chatter, nothing but the sound of our own heartbeats and the whisper of wind in the trees. "Did you see its eyes?" Jake finally asked. "What was left of them," I replied. "Poor bastards, blind as a bat." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the ground where the bear had been standing. Blind bears are dangerous bear. They can't judge threats properly, and they rely on hearing and smell, makes them unpredictable. I wanted to suggest we head back to camp, but I could see the calculation in Jake's eyes. This wasn't just any black bear. This was potentially a record book animal, the kind that hunters dream about their entire lives. And a blind bear, while dangerous, might also be easier to approach if we were smart about it. "We track it tomorrow morning," Jake decided. "Stay together, move careful, and if we get a clear shot at reasonable range, we take it. But we don't take any unnecessary risks." Agreed. I agreed. But I insisted we take turns on watch that night. Something about that bear had set off every alarm bell in my hunter's instinct. A blind predator, that size, trying to survive in the wilderness, would be desperate, unpredictable, and twice as dangerous as a normal bear. Jake took the first watch, sitting by our dying campfire with his rifle across his knees. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to sleep, but every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The snap of a cooling log in the fire, the rustle of Jake shifting position, the distant call of an owl that seemed to echo longer than it should. Around midnight, Jake woke me for my turn. He looked tired, with deep lines around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "Anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Quiet. Too quiet if you ask me. Haven't heard deer or elk moving around like they usually do at night. Could be that bear's got them spooked." I took his place by the fire, adding a few more pieces of wood to keep the flames alive. Jake disappeared into his tent, and within minutes I could hear him snoring softly. At least one of us could sleep. The next 4 hours tested my nerves like nothing ever had. I sat there in the firelight, surrounded by a wall of darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something massive. Every sound, and there weren't many, made me grip my rifle tighter. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something moving in the timber beyond our camp. Not the careful, quiet movement of a deer or elk, but something heavy, deliberate. Branches breaking under substantial weight. I stood up, rifle ready, and peered into the darkness. "Jake," I whispered, not wanting to wake him if it was nothing, but not wanting to face whatever was out there alone. The sounds stopped immediately, as if whatever was making them had heard me. I waited, hardly breathing, for what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes. Nothing. No more sounds, no movement, just the oppressive weight of being watched from the darkness. I didn't wake Jake. Looking back, maybe I should have. Dawn came grey and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering everything in camp. Jake was already up, packing his gear with a methodical precision that came from the years of hunting in challenging conditions. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Something was moving around out there around 2, I told him. Couldn't see what it was, but it sounded big. Jake nodded, checking the action on his rifle. "Found some tracks by the creek this morning. Same bear, I think. Trail heads north, up toward the ridge." We broke camp and began following the trail. In daylight, the tracks were even more impressive than they'd seemed the day before. The bear was taking steps that covered nearly 6 feet, and in the softer ground near the creek, we could see the full print, massive paws with claws that extended further than anything I'd ever seen on a black bear. But there were other tracks too. Mixed in with the bear's prints, pressed into the same soft earth, were what looked like human footprints. Bare feet, but larger than any man's shoe I'd ever seen, with an unusual gait, longer steps than a normal person would take, and the impression of someone walking on the balls of their feet rather than heel to toe. "What do you make of these?" I asked Jake, pointing to the strange prints. Jake studied them for a long moment. "Could be someone else camping up here. Maybe got caught without proper footwear, had to hike barefoot for some reason," but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The trail led us up a steep ridge through country that got rougher with every step. We climbed for 3 hours, following game trails that switched back up the mountainside through thick stands of fir and hemlock. The air got thinner, colder, and despite being in good shape, I found myself breathing hard. It was near the top of the ridge that we found the first kill site. The smell hit us before we saw anything, that unmistakable stench of death and decay that makes your stomach turn and your instincts scream danger. We followed our noses to a small clearing where we found the remains of what had been a large bull elk. I've seen plenty of predator kills over the years, but this was different. The elk had been torn apart with a violence that seemed excessive, even for a large predator. Ribs were snapped in half, the skull was crushed, and pieces of the carcass were scattered across a wide area. What was left was partially buried under a mound of dirt, leaves, and branches, typical bear behaviour for cashing a kill, but taken to an extreme. "Look at the trees," Jake said quietly. I followed his gaze and felt my blood chill. The trees surrounding the clearing were marked with claw gouges, some reaching 12 feet up the trunks. It looked like something had climbed them, using claws to grip the bark, leaving deep furrows that oozed sap. But the most disturbing thing was the pattern. The marks weren't random. They formed what looked like deliberate scratches, almost like someone trying to write or communicate. Crude symbols carved into the bark with powerful claws. "I've never seen a bear do anything like this," I said. Jake was taking pictures with his camera, documenting the unusual behaviour. "Neither have I. This is incredible. Might be some kind of territorial marking we've never seen before. We need to document everything." While Jake photographed the claw marks and the scattered remains, I kept watch, scanning the tree line. The silence in this clearing was absolute. No birds, no insects, nothing. It felt like we were standing in a dead zone where nothing wanted to linger. That's when I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Just at the tree line, about 50 yards away, something large was moving through the shadows. I raised my binoculars and caught a glimpse of dark fur, massive shoulders, and that same odd, tilted head movement I'd seen before. "Jake," I whispered. He looked up from his camera, followed my gaze, and we both watched as the blind bear emerged partially from the tree line. In better light, I could see the full extent of its injuries. The left side of its face was scarred, probably from an old fight or accident that had cost it the eye. The right eye was clouded with cataracts or infection, but despite its blindness, the bear moved with purpose, its head constantly turning as it tested the air for scent. The bear seemed to sense our presence. Its massive head turned toward us, and it rose up on its hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall. For a moment, it was completely still, like a statue carved from dark wood. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't quite a roar, and it wasn't quite a bellow. It was the sound of an animal in pain, deep, resonant, filled with a loneliness and frustration that made my chest ache. The sound echoed off the surrounding peaks, seeming to go on forever. Jake raised his rifle, but before he could get a clean shot, the bear dropped to all fours and disappeared back into the timber. "Did you get a shot?" I asked. "Too much brush," Jake replied, lowering his rifle. "But I got plenty of photos. This is going to be the story of a lifetime." I could see the excitement in his eyes, but all I felt was a growing sense of unease. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. The violence of the kill site, the strange claw marks, the way the bear moved despite being blind, it all added up to an animal that was desperate, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. We made camp that evening about a mile from the kill site, choosing a defensible position on high ground, with good visibility in all directions. The weather was starting to change. Clouds were building to the west, and the wind had picked up. The storm the forecasters had predicted was coming in ahead of schedule. "We need to make a decision," I told Jake as we ate dinner by the light of our camp stove. "Weather's turning bad, and we're dealing with an animal that's not behaving normally. Maybe we should consider heading down in the morning." Jake shook his head. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A bear this size, this unusual, we can't just walk away. Besides, if that storm hits, it might drive the bear down to lower elevations where it could encounter hikers or campers. We could be doing a public service by taking it." I wanted to argue, but I could see that same obsession taking hold of him that I'd seen when he was tracking wounded game. That single-minded focus that wouldn't be satisfied until he found what he was looking for. We took turns on watch again that night, and this time the sounds were closer, more frequent. Heavy footsteps circling our camp, staying just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Branches breaking under enormous weight, and occasionally that same mournful sound we'd heard at the kill site, the cry of an animal in constant pain. Jake took the first watch, and I tried to get some sleep in my tent, but every time I started to drift off, I'd hear those sounds from the forest around us. Around midnight, I heard Jake get up from his position by the fire. I assumed he was just stretching his legs or adding wood to keep the flames going. But after a few minutes, when I didn't hear him moving around, I looked out of my tent. The fire was still burning. Jake's rifle was leaning against a log where he'd left it, but Jake was gone. I grabbed my AR-10 and came out of the tent, calling his name in a harsh whisper. No answer. I checked his tent empty, sleeping bag still warm. His boots were gone, but everything else was exactly where he had left it. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, rifle across my knees, calling Jake's name every few minutes and getting no response except the echo of my own voice bouncing off the surrounding peaks. I told myself he'd just gone to relieve himself and gotten disoriented in the dark. It happens to experienced outdoorsmen more often than you'd think. He'd be back at first light, probably embarrassed and ready with a story about following some sound that turned out to be nothing. But dawn came grey and cold, and Jake didn't return. I should have hiked out right then, should have left everything, and made my way down that mountain as fast as my legs would carry me. But Jake Morrison was my best friend, and I wasn't about to abandon him to whatever was lurking in those woods. I spent the morning searching the area around our camp, looking for any sign of where Jake might have gone. It didn't take long to find his tracks leading away from the fire, heading north toward the ridge. His boot prints were clear in the soft earth, but after about 50 yards, they were joined by others. The same large bear footprints we'd been seeing mixed with the bear's tracks. But now, studying them more carefully in good light, I realised they weren't human footprints at all. They were the prints of the bear walking upright on its hind legs, something black bears can do for short distances, but rarely choose to unless they're trying to get a better view or smell of something. The trail was relatively easy to follow. Jake's boots left clear impressions, and the bear's tracks, both four-footed and bipedal, showed it had been paralleling Jake's route, sometimes walking alongside him, sometimes following behind. What disturbed me was that Jake's tracks showed no sign of running or struggling. He seemed to have been walking normally, as if he wasn't aware of the danger following him. It was slow going, made worse by the changing weather. The storm was definitely coming in. I could see snow falling on the peaks above us, and the wind was picking up. I had maybe 6 hours before conditions became dangerous. By noon, I'd covered about 2 miles, following the trail higher up the mountain into country I'd never seen before. The trees were older here, massive Douglas firs and western cedars that had been growing since before white settlers reached these mountains. Their canopy was so thick that even at midday, it felt like walking through perpetual twilight. That's where I found Jake's hat. It was caught on a branch about 7 feet off the ground, torn and stained with what looked like blood. The fabric was ripped as if something with claws had grabbed it and pulled it off Jake's head. But what really bothered me was its position too high for Jake to have snagged it naturally, and in a location that suggested it had been deliberately placed there. I stood under that hat for a long time, looking up at it, trying to piece together what had happened. Had Jake been running? Had something attacked him? Or had he somehow gotten the hat caught while climbing? I was so focused on the hat that I almost missed the sound behind me. Breathing. Slow, laboured breathing, like something with respiratory problems struggling for air. I spun around, rifle ready, and found myself face to face with the blind bear. It was less than 30 feet away, standing upright on its hind legs, its ruined face turned in my direction. This close, I could see the full extent of its injuries. The scarred flesh around its missing eye looked old, healed over years ago. The remaining eye was completely clouded over with cataracts, but despite its blindness, the bear had moved to within striking distance without making a sound. The bear's massive head moved from side to side as it tested the air for my scent. Its breathing was laboured, wheezy, like an old man with lung problems. I could smell the animal musk of its fur, mixed with something else, the smell of infection, of wounds that weren't healing properly. My finger was on the trigger of my AR-10. At this range, I couldn't miss. One shot through the vitals would drop even an animal this size, but something held me back, maybe the knowledge that this creature knew where Jake was. Maybe just the realization that I was looking at an animal in constant pain, fighting to survive in a world it could no longer see clearly. The bear dropped to all fours, the impact shaking the ground beneath my feet. But instead of charging, it turned and began walking away. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back at me, its head tilted in that characteristic way. The message was clear: follow. I shouldn't have done it. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around, to get out of those mountains and call for help. But Jake was out there somewhere, and this animal was the only clue I had to finding him. I followed, keeping about 50 yards back, my rifle always ready. The bear led me deeper into the old-growth forest, along trails that hadn't seen human footsteps in decades. We climbed higher, the air getting thinner and colder, until we reached a region that felt completely untouched by civilization. The trees here were giants, ancient cedars and firs that had been growing for centuries. After what felt like hours of walking, the bear stopped at the edge of a small clearing. In the centre stood the remains of what had once been a cabin, rough-hewn logs now grey with age, the roof collapsed inward, windows just dark holes staring out at the surrounding forest. The bear looked back at me one more time, then disappeared into the shadows around the cabin. Oh! I approached carefully, rifle at the ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The cabin was old, probably built by some trapper or prospector in the early 1900s. The logs were hand-cut, fitted together with the skill of someone who knew he'd be depending on this structure to survive brutal mountain winters. But it was what surrounded the cabin that made my stomach turn. Bones, scattered around the clearing like some kind of primitive garbage dump. Animal bones, mostly deer, elk, smaller game, but they'd been here for years, decades maybe. Some were bleached white by sun and weather, others were still dark with dried organic matter, and carved into the trees around the clearing, scratched into the cabin's log walls. were more of those strange marks I'd seen at the kill site, layer upon layer of crude scratches that looked almost like writing, as if someone had been trying to communicate but didn't know how to form proper letters. I was studying the marks on the cabin wall when I heard Jake call my name. The sound came from inside the ruined structure, muffled but unmistakably human. "Jake!" I shouted, running toward the cabin, kicking through scattered bones. "Jake, I'm here!" The calling stopped as I reached the doorway. I peered inside, trying to let my eyes adjust to the darkness within. The interior of the cabin was a disaster. The roof had collapsed years ago, leaving the floor covered with rotting wood, leaves, and more bones. In the far corner, something large and dark was crouched over what looked like a human form. The bear, but not standing upright this time, down on all fours, its massive bulk filling the small space. It looked up as I entered, and I saw something in its remaining eye that I'd never seen in a wild animal before recognition. Not just awareness of my presence, but actual recognition, as if it knew who I was. The form beneath it moved slightly, and I heard Jake's voice, weak but definitely alive. Don't shoot." I raised my rifle, centering the crosshairs on the bear's massive chest. At this range, even through brush and dim light, I couldn't miss. "Get away from him," I said, my finger on the trigger. The bear didn't move. It just stared at me with that cloudy eye, its breathing laboured and wet. "Please," Jake's voice came again, weaker now. "Don't shoot. It's not what you think." But I could see blood on Jake's clothes, see the way he was lying motionless, except for his laboured breathing. Whatever this bear had done to him, he was badly hurt. I pulled the trigger. The .308 round took the bare centre mass, the sound of the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The animal staggered backward, dark blood spreading across its fur, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the wound, then back at me, with what I could only describe as disappointment. It turned and walked out of the cabin, moving slowly but steadily, leaving a trail of blood in the debris-covered floor. I rushed to Jake's side. He was conscious but in bad shape, deep gashes across his chest and arms. His left leg bent at an unnatural angle, but he was alive. "Jake, what happened? How long have you been here?" He looked up at me with eyes that were too bright, feverish. It brought me here. Didn't attack me, just led me here. Like it wanted to show me something. "Show you what?" Jake pointed toward the far wall of the cabin with a trembling hand. Following his gesture, I saw more of those crude symbols carved into the logs, but these were different, more detailed, almost like a story told in primitive pictures. "It's been trying to communicate," Jake whispered. "The scratches, the symbols, it's been trying to tell someone about this place, about what happened here." I helped Jake sit up, checking his wounds as best I could in the dim light. The gashes were deep, but not life-threatening if we could get him medical attention soon. The leg was definitely broken, though he wasn't going to be walking out of these mountains. "Jake, we need to get you out of here. Can you travel if I support you?" He shook his head. "Can't put weight on the leg. And there's something else. Look at those symbols more carefully. Really look at them." Against my better judgment, I studied the carvings on the wall. The crude scratches did seem to form patterns, rough drawings that might have been telling a story. I could make out what looked like human figures, animals, and something that might have been the cabin itself. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" "Those aren't bear claw marks," Jake said. "Look at the detail, the precision. Bears don't carve stories into wood." A chill ran down my spine as I realised what he was suggesting. "Jake, you're hurt. You're not thinking clearly. The footprints we've been following," he continued, his voice getting stronger despite his injuries. "They're not from a bear walking upright. They're from someone who's been living like an animal for so long, he's forgotten how to be human." Before I could respond, I heard breathing from the doorway behind me. I spun around, rifle ready, and saw the bear standing in the entrance. Blood was still seeping from the wound in its chest, but it was standing steady, watching us. But now, I noticed things I'd missed before. The way it held its front paws, not like a typical bear, but with more dexterity, almost like hands. The intelligence in its remaining eye, the way it seemed to be listening to our conversation. "My God," I whispered. The bear, or what had once been a man, looked directly at me. then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. Jake and I spent the next hour in that ruined cabin, while I tried to figure out how to get him down the mountain. The storm was getting worse. I could hear wind howling through the trees, and snow was beginning to fall. We had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. "You have to leave me here," Jake said finally. "Like hell. Listen to me. You can't carry me down the mountain in this weather. We'll both die. Go get help. Come back with a search and rescue team." I knew he was right, but the thought of leaving my best friend alone in this place, with that thing roaming the woods, was almost unbearable. "What if it comes back?" Jake managed a weak smile. "I don't think it's going to hurt me. If it wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. It had all night to kill me, but it didn't. It kept me warm, actually. Shared its body heat." The implications of that statement were staggering, but I didn't have time to process them. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and if I was going to get help, I needed to leave now. I left Jake my sleeping bag, most of my food, and a flare gun in case of emergency. Then I began the long, dangerous hike down the mountain as snow began to fall in earnest. It took me 8 hours to reach the trailhead, hiking through what became a full blizzard. By the time I reached my truck, there was already 6 inches of snow on the ground and more falling fast. The search and rescue team couldn't get up the mountain for 3 days due to the storm. When we finally made it back to the old cabin, we found Jake's body partially buried under a mound of pine boughs and debris not scattered by scavengers, but carefully arranged, almost like a burial. Of the creature we'd encountered, there was no sign except for massive tracks in the snow leading deeper into the mountains, toward peaks that no search team would ever follow. The official report listed Jake's death as the result of a bear attack, injuries sustained when he became separated from his hunting partner during a storm. The strange symbols carved into the cabin walls were attributed to old trapper markings, possibly territorial signs left by someone who'd lived there decades ago. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those mountains, in country too remote and dangerous for casual exploration, lived something that was once a man, someone who got lost up there years ago, maybe decades, and survived by becoming something else, something that's forgotten how to be human, but still remembers enough to feel the terrible loneliness of its existence. I think about Jake's words sometimes, about how the creature had tried to keep him warm, had led him to shelter instead of simply killing him. Maybe it was looking for companionship, for someone who could understand its isolation. Maybe those symbols were its attempt to tell the story of its transformation, to leave some record of what it had been before the mountains claimed it. I never went back to those mountains, never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling through the trees outside my house, I think about that thing up there in the high country, still alive, still hunting, still carving its lonely story into trees that no one will ever read. And I wonder if someday, some other hunter will venture too deep into those woods and find fresh symbols carved into the bark, new additions to a story that began with one lost soul and has been growing ever since, one mark at a time, as the mountains slowly claim anyone foolish enough to stay too long in their embrace. The bear had no eyes, but it could see things the rest of us miss. It could see the line between civilization and wilderness, between human and animal, between the living and the lost. And now, when I close my eyes, I can see it too, standing alone on some windswept ridge, its massive form silhouetted against the stars, still searching for something it lost long ago and will never find again. The mountains keep their secrets, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the deep wilderness, and you'll come across symbols carved into trees, claw marks that seem too deliberate to be random, remember this story. Remember that some things that look like animals might once have been something else entirely. And if you hear something moving in the darkness beyond your campfire, something that breathes like a man but moves like a beast, don't go looking for it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again,